Okay, welcome back. This is part two of our presentation with Dr. Joshua Pierson. And we got Dr. Michael Gloss. It must be nice to have a doctor in front of the name. I'm just
I
saying, because mine's not like
think
that.
it's going to be nice, and then it wears off. It's like learning to shave. Like you're so excited when you're a kid that you're going to get to learn to shave, and then you do it 2 times and it's awesome. And then the third time somebody calls you doctor or you have to shave, you're like, oh, let's just not do this. But
It's just, you know what I would do is I would go to the coffee shop first thing. And when they say, okay, so what's your name? It'd be Dr. Jason
doc,
Gilmet. And if they say like Jason, like announce your name of the cup, I said Dr. Jason Gilmet.
I mean, there is like a breed of person who once they get their doctorate insists on being called a doctor.
Yeah.
And the whole time I was doing mine, I was like, I can never be that person. I just
It's like when somebody's on the plane and somebody's having a heart attack that says, they're a doctor. I'm a
I'm like,
doctor.
yes, I
Yeah,
actually am a doctor. Not the kind that I don't know any of this stuff, but if
yeah.
a lesson on the history of philosophy,
It's
I'd
like,
love
could you please help this man? Yes. Have you heard of Socrates?
to. Quick, we need a lecture on the pre-Socratic. Somebody.
Yeah, I'll keep him entertained till we get down to source. Well, Joshua, thank you for joining us again. It's always great to have you on. We do look forward to this session. Katie is away this week. I think she's doing something fun. I forgot what it was,
It's an
but
air show, I think.
Oh, nice.
yeah, most probably a way better one that's going downtown. We have an air show here in town. I'm just not really impressed with it. You guys got way better equipment than we do. The Canadian government is so sad. And there was a comedian that said this years ago. Um, in the Canadian government, we have two fully functional submarine. It's like, ooh, West Edmonton Mall has three fully functioning submarine. The mall has more submarines than our Canadian Navy does. It's sad. But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this episode. And the reason is you start going through your data. This is the part I'm really interested in because this is how I want to learn how to collect the data and do analytics. And obviously, you've done this your whole life, so it's going to be a learning curve for me. Michael, what are you looking forward to in this one?
I I'm kind of like a methods geek. So looking at like his exclusion and inclusion criteria is something I mean, he and I have talked about it several times privately, but this is the part that I really geek out on because a lot of people, when they come to this topic, are skeptical that there is like real data worth looking at. You know, they think it's all just your neighbor saw a thing in the
Yeah.
sky. But when you sit down and say, well, look, here's the sort of events or observations that we would really want to take seriously, and you set down those criteria, and then you look through all the cases, you find that there's just tons and tons of this stuff. So that's what I really geek out on, and that's kind of where we're starting today, I think.
Yeah, and it's approaching it where if somebody wants to critique your work, they could go and look at the cases like Joshua set it all up. Like, hey, you want to go look at it, go ahead. Like, if you come up to a different conclusion, let me know. But this is what we got. And I see that on obviously Twitter quite a bit where people argue points and saying, well, it's all hearsay. It's like, no, it's not.
Oh,
There's plenty of credible witnesses and events that are documented as being actual, factual events. So, Joshua, I'm going to give you the helm, my man. Let's delve back in and maybe just we'll go back just a little bit. I think the CE3 encounter, we're going to go back just because we thought about this before we start recording. I think that's the area we left off last time.
I think so too. And I'll just walk through this slide again. It will be the best way to do it. One of the key points that I'm hoping that that your listeners take away is that this is using qualitative data, right? These are case studies, these are reports. And so in that regard, it's only as strong as how the information is taken from the witness and then put into the database, right? So when we start talking about, study X is completely flawed because they didn't include this or they didn't include that. What's important to remember is that when you're developing your analytical methodology and your data collection methodology, that you write this down because that's what makes your work, puts it in a position to be replicated, right? And that's key to any sort of qualitative study is that it should be able to be replicated. And when you get to that point, understanding that the observer and the report are two separate tangible things, right? The observer is tangible, and then the product of his observation is a report, right? Not often can we analyze the experiences of the observer. And I'm not saying that in a means to prove rationale or credibility. What's important about understanding the observer is that as a being, they've made a report, right? And this is one of the key points that the Society for UAP Studies covered in the conference this weekend is observer and report, two separate things, but they're also enjoined at the same time. And which is why when we look later on in my presentation at the end, we see why I have three separate reporting veins, one for the factual data taken from the observer, then one that covers what we would say the operational aspects. You know, how was the interaction? Was the observer receptive to the conversation? You know, were they willing to talk about who they brought this up to? You know, and how did that go, right? To better define, you know, what to the observer has happened, like an event has happened, whether or not people want to address the issues with, you know, the biases surrounding whether, you know, something is, to this person, it's real. And it's important to understand that that's the starting point, is it's not necessarily looking to prove an individual wrong, but it's looking to understand the tenets that made it real to them. Right. And how does that fit into the greater picture? And so what's important, you're looking at this slide with this exclusionary criteria. When I built the curation standard, all those other reports that were included, those were patterns of events that were real to the individuals who observed them. So which means we can state that something has happened. Right? Because not that many people over time would have these experiences and it just be one-offs or some sort of strange pathology. And that's a key point when understanding, when you're dealing with you know, inaccurate and incomplete databases and inaccurate and incomplete reports and information, that you have to establish your standard. And when you do, you adhere to that strictly. And if you change the rule, you go back, you start from step one and you do it again. And that's key in this, is that what I created should be able to be replicated. Findings might be different, but it should be able to be replicated. And so again, so getting back to this slide, these were those reports that were excluded. There were 1,684 reports that didn't meet the curation criteria. Single source reports were excluded right off the bat. And the reason why is even though you would get highly detailed single source reports, when you have nothing to verify that, difficulty arises in being able to justify the inclusion of the report, right? And you know, outside of a doctoral dissertation, I might have some latitude to justify inclusion of single source reports down the line when you know, comparing them with other data sets or other reports. But for this, they were excluded right off the bat because there was no other way to validate the report of the individual, which was very difficult because there were single source reports to where I would have 2 paragraphs of information, you know, with many signatures, and then discussions of experiences, interactions of the observer, which helped to, in other veins, establish credibility. But for this project, they had to be excluded. And then there was difficulty because I would get reports where there were 2 sources and they would only give me 3 signatures. You know, 2 guys walking down the road, looked up, saw a blue object that wasn't moving, and then it moved really, really fast and zigzagged and disappeared. And then that would be it, right? And so when you look at that, your system 1 style thinking, your intuitive thinking is like, this single source is more credible than these 2 sources. But you can't do that in a structured analytic technique. You have to use the rules that you set. And so you have to remove that single source report if that's one that you established at the beginning, and go with what you got with the 2 sources, right? Less than 3 signatures, that would be those reports to where you wouldn't have, you would just get 2 individuals observe something and it was blue and stayed in the sky. You know, that doesn't categorize the information. It doesn't sort it. You know, it doesn't discuss, you know, length of presence. It's missing the key points to where, as we see in later slides, what's important is that objects reported that met the curation standard in this presentation stayed within a specific time frame that would allow an observer to identify, sort, and categorize the information and interpret it, and then through their memoria, report it to someone else. And that's key. And so if I only had 2 signatures in a report, that could be a misobservation or misidentification very quickly. You look up, looks like something, you're not sure, so you move on. 3 signatures indicates that the time has been allotted to sort the information. No source provided, I'd get detailed report, or you would see detailed reports in the databases and some of the references where there was nothing associated with how the report was garnered other than it was in a newspaper or was relayed to somebody who then talked about it. When you start playing the telephone game and you get, X degrees from the event, it can change by orders of magnitude. So they were eliminated. CE3 encounter is probably the most profound. I think we talked about before, but I'll bring it up again. The CE3 is based off of J. Allen Hynek's close encounter protocol. Close encounter 1, witness observed something. Close encounter 2, some sort of physiological trace evidence was present with the observation. Close encounter 3, some sort of biological entity was reported with the observation. So what these 75 demonstrate is that there may be a relationship between the presence of biologics and the material aspects of UAP, right? And so when we start talking about the phenomena indicating some sort of means of manifesting at people, and I know I might be using the term manifest in an improper context there. It's been the best way I've been able to explain it, that it just kind of appears. It's just there, right? It's not there 1 second, next second it is. That when these material aspects just manifest, that there's also that in these 75 reports, there was indication of some sort of biological presence as well. That was not the observer or some other human being, but was either inside the object, the anomaly, had come out of the anomaly, was reported to be, one report was that it was, the biological entity was in a house when the disc was above the house. But for this project, I eliminated CE3 encounters because academia was not necessarily ready to explore that type of relationship. And then to truly focus on CE3, I would need an IRB review. And time is a thing with your dissertation. And so being that the results of not using CE3 encounters didn't affect the data sets in any meaningful manner, I took this as a means to explore it for further research. So one of my plans is to go back and look at these 75 cases, determine if they meet the other curation rules, after I make that determination, even though I've stated in previous presentations that they do, you still recheck your rules. You do that every single time. So I'm going to go back, recheck my rules, make sure that all 75 meet that standard. And then if they do, write a research paper off of those 75 cases to start to understand if any correlation exists between the presence of biologics and the material aspects of UAP. When I say material aspects, we talk about like propulsion, metal, like, natural type of phenomena that we use to describe it. And to determine if there's some sort of relationship with that. And I'm trying to stay away from terms like craft or because that limits, it reduces what it is we might be encountering. So multiple reference, same case, pretty self-explanatory with that one. You have 75 cases to where, they're in a series of books, and that's actually not a bad thing. That further justifies the credibility of the case. But what would happen is that I would use it one time, count it in one reference, and then I would cite it in my reference data set with the references that it was mentioned in, with the reference case number. So that way I don't get caught up looking back and going, why do I eliminate this? Like, oh, okay, it's in Keene, Clark, McDonald, and this other one, and then have to go back and so I have them all laid out so I know which one I'm using as my original case for the project. No location provided. I made it clear in my curation standard. It needed to be placed in space and time. So if someone just states, I saw something and gives me a ton of signatures and they say they saw it like April 4th, 1974, but they don't tell me where, then there's no way to determine, if that person is wholly truthful. And again, it's not a ding against the person reporting. It could very well be that they just forgot. That's the issue, is ensuring that that the analysis informs findings based off of your curation standard, and you are sticking to that. In structured analytic techniques for intelligence analysis, they talk about system 1, system 2 style thinking. I know that a lot of academics have addressed system 1, system 2. System 1 being your intuition, which can be affected by your cognitive bias. System 2 being highly analytical, and how do we train ourselves to focus on system 2 thinking? This is how. They didn't put a location down. You have to eliminate it. Even though system 1 says this may be good, it doesn't meet your rule, move on. Same thing with no date provided. I get a location, I don't get a date. It further diminishes the credibility of the report. Not necessarily the credibility of the source, but of the report. Indications of report controversy. That's where it just seemed to conflict within the report itself. There were a few cases to where these 24 met all the curation rules, with the exception that they were contradicting themselves within their own report. So, if you can't figure out what the logical sequence of thought is, it degrades the use of the report overall. You got to remove it. Indications of UAP event. Just because you see burnt grass doesn't mean a UAP occurred. There had to be something that occurred within that space and time of the burnt grass that the witness observed that validates that the grass may have been burnt, or correlates with the presence of the UAP that led to the burnt grass, right? And so 22 of those reports had some sort of indication. They would state that witness would report that they had missing time gap, and they may have had this strange feeling. They walk outside, they see burnt grass, the dogs are kind of going crazy, but that's it, right? Now, we would intuit UAP event, but we don't know. And it's important to keep that in mind. And again, I want to stress this. This does not mean the witness lacks credibility. It just means they don't have all the information that would help to make the report usable, right? And so that's key, because, I don't want people to take away that this somehow diminishes credibility of witnesses. There's other means of determining credibility of witnesses that are not always tied to the report of the information, right? And there's a whole process for doing that, that I've used throughout, my career. But when I don't have access to the witness and I have access to the report, I have to establish veracity based on what I have available. Multiple reports with a synopsis provided, 6 or 7 people come out like, yeah, UAP showed up here, and it did some crazy stuff. And it kind of, and there's no real storyline about what happened. It's just, some stuff happened. It's cool. Not necessarily usable, because now you're describing the event, or you're describing your relationship to the event, not the event itself. And so, those had to be eliminated. And then multiple secondary sources, these 12 reports would have, you have observer, and then you have all these people that talk to the observer, but nobody's extracted information to put a report together from what the observer stated. They're adding their own interpretation. So basically, they are reporting the event based on how they relate to the event. Also had to be removed. And now we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, and so now this is the analytical methodology. I ended up with 684 reports. It's a lot of data, 684 reports over and 42 signatures.
That's after all the exclusions.
After all the exclusions, 684 reports and 42 exclusions. or I'm sorry, in 42 signatures. And to go back to the exclusionary criteria, when you do the math there, it may not add up to 1,684 because there's areas where I had to count reports that were excluded based on multiple criteria, right? But they each got their own numeric. And so if the math's a bit off, that's why. Again, like you need to make sure that you're tracking your, you are working this through your data collection. When you're working this through your data collection process, that you're applying this level of detail, because this is what establishes the veracity of your findings, is how strong is your methodology. When we want to debate authenticity of qualitative information, we should be debating the findings because the methodology, or we should be debating the findings because the methodology should be strong enough that it has minimal questions to determine veracity of the report. And that was my overall intent with using structured analytic techniques. Okay, so getting to this slide, the methodology analysis. Used a funnel, to demonstrate how I took these 684 reports and 42 signatures and pared them down to something that was usable. And how that worked is after I gathered all the signatures and had the reports laid out, I established profile groups, right? And this is where, I had to apply some arbitrary standards to classify these signatures. So that way it would make sense to what it is it's attempting to inform. And so that's where we had, the speed profile group, the attributes, the capabilities, and what that was doing was allowing me to classify certain types of signatures into certain groups. So when I write a profile statement, I have a logical sequence that I can follow to develop a profile statement, which in the dissertation I have, the profile statements laid out. Also in subsequent slides, you will see what those profile statements become. So in speed, for example, you'd have, various ranges from stasis to hypersonics. You would have, zigzag motion, moving fast to sudden stop, things like that. So that way, when you talk speed, they all fit within the definition of what would be speed. In assess capability, you'd have something like anti-gravity, positive lift, which those are two separate things. And I've had several physicists validate that anti-gravity and positive lift are two separate things. So that's important when you're trying to make a distinction with signatures. And this is where Dr. Davis's expertise was critical, because when these signatures would come up, and I said, okay, I've got these profile groups, this is how I'm looking to frame them. What do you think? And when I put anti-gravity in an attributes block as opposed to capability, and same thing, when I said anti-gravity and positive lift are essentially the same thing, he's like, no, they're not. One takes propulsion, one doesn't. That's important to understand, right? So that's where his expertise came in to make sure these were framed out. So after organizing these 42 signatures into these 5 profile groups, I then compared them to the number one reported signature, which was shape. Shape was reported 539 times. It tends to be the simplest thing to state when we are classifying an object that we observe. And so all 5 of these profile groups is what was compared to the shapes. Within the shapes, there were 12 that were reported. Broke that. I took those 12 because the further away you get from center, the less shapes that are reported. And so with those less shapes that are reported, it's hard to build a profile off of it, right? So I think of a shape that was a triangle, like a 3D triangle. There are like four or 5 reports of 3D triangles. You can't really build a profile off of 4 or 5 reports of triangles. And so I broke it down into 3 groups: the triangle UAP, which was reported 184 times, the disc UAP, which was reported 152 times, and then the combined shapes, which, taking those other 10 shapes, putting them together, came out to be 232 reports. Now, I already understand that in that point, we could make the argument that would mean that my analysis is a little flawed with the combined shapes. It's not necessarily a bad thing but what it does is understanding that there are essentially 4 to 5 primary shapes, but grouping them in this manner, it allows you to better understand, the taxonomy of what is a triangle UAP or a disc, like what are these signatures they're exhibiting. And then with the combined shapes, it opens the aperture for further research to explore, okay, well, how many times is, a diamond reported that has a sphere inside of it? And how many, and can we build a profile of just that shape? Right. And so, but within the context of this dissertation, it wasn't necessarily possible to do that. So that's why in the combined shapes, you have 232 different, shapes in there. Spheres are also in the combined shapes because there were, I believe, 68 reports of spheres. I was trying to get to the metric of about 127 because through some experiences I've had with military officers who have their PhDs. The number 127 kept coming up as a recommended sample to be able to analyze a data set. You'll start seeing patterns within roughly 127 of whatever X equals, right? And so that's why my goal was 127. Please don't ask me to cite that. That was brought up to me something like 10 years ago now, so it's lost to memory, and I've been Googling like crazy. I can't find it. So if anybody's watching that and is aware of that, I would love to have that reference, so just something to throw out there. But I was trying to get to 127. And so with the combined shapes, putting it up to 232 is what got me there, but you still have the different shape classifications. I didn't lose that in the data set. So I can still look at spheres, cigars, the other various shapes that are reported. And I didn't say that cigars were discs or triangles. A lot of people make that jump. We don't know. We just know what the person sees. So you got to stick with what the observer states. If he states cigar, that's the shape. Cigar does not indicate disc. Disc does not indicate cigar. So, okay, so moving on, then I created the profile signatures, the profile statements of signature and shape. That's when I started writing it out, and then I plotted it all on a map. And lucky for us, we get to see all that. So next slide. Here's my findings and conclusions, right? Before we jump into what it is when people say disc, this is so these are the key points that came out of that dissertation. First, these signatures are observable, right? You can see them without any sort of support, so unaided, or you can see them through a telescope. Was it theodolite? Am I saying that right? Theodolite,
Yeah.
camera, radar, like it's observed, right? Something is happening within our space and time, and that's integral to understanding the phenomena, right? So they're observable. So people aren't just making this up, and so we should keep that in mind as we're moving forward with UAP research. These encounters tend to occur most often at night. There's a key finding out of this dissertation. So, I don't know what that means. We could speculate on what that is, but it could also be because the propulsion is better, observed at night. These the color differences. What's interesting in Dr. Shadegas's presentation that he's given to the Society for UAP Studies and to the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, he talks about the Doppler effect and how through the Doppler effect that what people are reporting by color, is possibly measurable to determine heat. Now, I'm going to stop talking about that too much there because I'm not a physicist. And what that means to me as a career investigator and intelligence professional is I go to the physicist and go, okay, when you say we can measure the color based off of what the person is reporting, what does that mean in this context? And then that's when I start seeking those subject matter experts to work that out. But what's interesting here is that means that these colors are not made up, that some sort of reaction may be occurring within our again, within our, natural environment that can be observed and measured. And so if they're occurring at night, maybe that's what it is because it's giving off colors and we can see it. Again, that's speculative. All I know is they occur at night, right? Now their duration ranges from a few seconds to several days. That seems like a wide swath, right? So let's look at what the most common is. 1 to 59 minutes. And if we break that down a little further, it's between 7 to 10 minutes that these objects tend to remain present. So just think about that for a second. That means that if you observe something for the full 7 to 10 minutes, what is it that you can remember off of that? You have enough time to potentially grab a notebook and take notes. You might be able to get a picture, right? And then of course there's all the speculation about grainy pictures and just the talk surrounding that point. But I think that's important to understand that if it's hanging for 7 to 10 minutes, when I say hanging, it's just present, you might be able to extrapolate some key information off of that. The least common presence was 8+ hours, but they were still there. There were a few reports to where they would just linger, it'd just stay for days and would move across, the atmosphere for days at a time, and then it would disappear or, dematerialize over, as time progressed. They're encountered by a diverse population. It's not just civilian eyewitnesses. It's not just some guy standing on his back porch, staring up at the sky, and then, sees something and then nobody believes him because he's the town crazy man to begin with, right? And it's a diverse population. And so, in understanding that these are the 5 core groups that reported it, further indicates that not only are the witnesses credible, but the information they're providing is truthful, and therefore we can make the assumption that something is manifesting or is present. Something is present that they are observing within our space and time. Broad spectrum of reports over 80+ years. There's a lot of talk about the national security domain and UAP relation to that particular element. When I started the dissertation, I began with, I'm only going to focus on UAP events at national security locations. As I was going through basic research, I kept, something kept sticking in the back of my head about only focusing on national security locations and artifacts. If I were to only focus on national security sites and artifacts, I would be further expanding or feeding into a cognitive bias that these things only occur with elements of national security or national security locations. And so the more I continued to conduct basic research, the more that a pattern was emerging that seemed to contradict that bias. We can state in the SCU intention study, we can state that there is an interest in national security sites, institutions, artifacts, elements. Like, it's there, it's present. But is that the norm? Is that the only focus? Is that the primary focus? And one of the key points within my dissertation is that we have a broad spectrum of reports. And so over these 80 years, the ratio of presence at national security sites and just general areas within my data set based off of the curation standards that I set appeared to be rather 50-50, if not more on the civilian side, less on the national security side. So it tended to indicate something else, right? It indicated that, we may not know what the interest is, but, there is an interest in national security locations. We've seen that over time, but we've also seen that UAP reports of UAP occur, globally. And so that are not related to national security sites. And there's a healthy number between the two that I'm not sure that we could make that distinction just yet. But we do know that there is an interest in national security locations. I'm not sure if it's the primary one, but again, that's based off of my data set that was curated for this project. And that's important to keep in mind, is that if I were to conduct a study to determine if it's only focused on national security sites, I would have to look at several UAP studies over time of UAP at national security sites and UAP not at national security sites, and then compare the two. That's how I would do it, right? So I'm not sure, like, I'm not ready to take that on just yet, because that in and of itself could be a separate dissertation. So, maybe for a postdoc sometime down the line, we could look at that. But, right now, that's just a key finding to state that, it may not only be focused on national security sites, but there is a focus. Whatever the phenomena is, it tends to gravitate, in and around national security locations as well. The original 12 signatures proposed by the US government were not the most reported or collected, right? So this isn't really a groundbreaking finding, because the means and methods by which US government entities look at these types of problems just may be different than how I look at it. And that's not an issue, right? If their focus is on, specific technological, signatures that whatever it is may be emitting, it might be different than I'm just going to go ahead and look at these data sets and see what signatures emerge, right? That doesn't discredit the efforts of the US government to propose these 12 signatures. It just states that we're doing things differently. So it's not necessarily a groundbreaking finding, but it was something that I thought was unique, that the 12 that the US government proposed were not the most often reported or collected. And so should we focus on those that are most often reported or collected, or do we focus on, or do we do both, right? Do we focus on what the US government's looking at, or do we both, right? And that's really what that key finding, is attempting to illuminate. We're going to talk about finding 7 with analysis of competing hypotheses over subsequent slides. I think I've got 3 slides on analysis of competing hypotheses. The finding that emerged using ACH was that it indicates a technology beyond the scope of current material science capabilities. It is not owned by the US or foreign competitor. Now, a lot of speculation can come off of that. All that is a statement stating we don't know where it's coming from. There's a bunch of stuff happening. We don't know where it's coming from. We don't know why. And if we do know why, I obviously don't know why, and we don't know how, right? And so that's key to better understand what it is that we might be encountering, is that it doesn't appear to originate from the US or foreign competitor. And the key analytical piece that supports that finding was that the signatures reported in reports that were coming out in 2010, similar to ones coming out in 1942. So that's integral to understanding, the overarching, issues surrounding the phenomena. Okay, so analysis of competing hypotheses. We're told to show our work, and this is my math problem. So I took some creative license under the guidance of my dissertation committee. Step 1A actually is supposed to be identify possible hypotheses. But if you're going to use possible hypotheses, you have to start with a null hypothesis. Being that one of the things I communicated with the board is that we don't necessarily have a null hypothesis other than UAP don't exist and it's not real. But even then, in that regard, I'm not so sure I would stand on that as a null hypothesis, right? So I said, I'm not sure we have one, so what would be the null hypothesis? And after, several conversations, we settled on use scenario outcomes. And so what is key about using structured analytic techniques is that you can use the language that you need to conduct the process, right? So changing it from hypotheses to outcome does not degrade the tool of analysis of competing hypotheses, right? It just, you use what you can. It's at some point, You have to amalgamate what it is you're working with in order to make sure you have your process set. And as long as you stick to the rule of how it works, then your results are authentic at the end, right? And so what is analysis of competing hypotheses, right? You have essentially, the name informs the definition as it should. You have ideas that you think that may occur or something that may happen. And instead of using system one thinking to where you're trying to intuit the which one's going to be more, which one's most likely, you use a system to determine viability of those hypotheses based on positive, negative, and not applicable. And then you do math, right? Once you validate which piece of evidence best aligns with which hypotheses, and at times they could align with both or all three, you do the math, and at the end, whichever one is the highest, that's what your hypothesis is. Okay, so now we're going to talk about analysis of competing hypotheses, right? And on this slide, we're taught growing up, you got to show your work, do math. You can't just give an answer. You have to, show how you got that answer. So this is my math, right? Not nearly as many numbers and letters put together with, orders of operation. But this is what, when we're building analysis of competing hypotheses, this is a methodology that we're working through. This is a model, right? And so what is this? This is a means of evaluating ideas of what you think may happen, over X or Y or Z, right? So you have three different ideas, which would be your hypotheses. And then you take all the evidence or all the data points that you got through your research and you run them through this process. And then at the end, you're adding them up based on, which hypothesis they best support and which hypothesis that they contradict. And if they don't have any bearing on the hypothesis, then it gets not applicable. But if you look at step one, it says 1 alpha, identify possible scenario outcomes. We changed, after reviewing with my committee, we determined that a null hypothesis in and of itself with UAP is hard to determine right now, because the null hypothesis would be these objects don't exist. There's nothing going on, and it's all just kind of noise, right? And so that may be one null hypothesis. We could use another null hypothesis of, well, there's something here, it's been here forever, and we just can't observe it, right? And so when we were talking about how we would apply a null hypothesis to this, especially looking at what the scenarios were, which we'll see in subsequent slides, we all agreed that maybe hypotheses would not be the best approach. So we went with scenario outcomes, right? And so, but what's key here is not the change in language, right? Just because I'm saying identify possible scenario outcomes and not identify possible hypotheses does not degrade the tool. The process still stands because we're still able to evaluate scenario outcomes off of the evidence brought in, right? And so you develop your three scenarios, right? In my dissertation, there were 4. After you develop your three scenarios, you develop your key assumptions. You don't want any more than 3. At best, if you can, but again, understanding that this is a qualitative tool, right? So it changes with the person doing the research, that we went up to, that I think I had 5 key assumptions that drove the research, right? And so while you're doing your research, what's important to keep in mind is that you can't be married to an assumption either, right? So your assumption may change. And if it changes, you got to go back, start over, and work yourself through again, right? And so that's what keeps the integrity of the results intact, is that, if you have to change your data collection model, you start at step 1 again. If you have to change your key assumption, you start over again to make sure that the key assumption stands. But again, as your key assumptions are what they are, they may change, right? And then you move to steps 2 through 6. Now, ACH is an 8-step process. I went through step 7. Step 7, which is not depicted on this slide, is write your conclusions, right? And so step 7 we see was actually finding 7 was that was the ultimate conclusion, which was scenario 4, which we'll see in a different slide. But how it works is you identify the evidence, and as you identify the evidence, you write it out in the evidence narrative. right? You want to try to keep that as concise as possible. You know, but because it can get real harrowing. And then if you have it too long and then you have multiple pieces of evidence looped together or lumped together, and then it's hard to make a definitive judgment as to, you know, the authenticity or accuracy of what it is you're reporting. So as like a general rule, we try to keep it to 2 to 3 lines, because any more than that, you could end up overwhelming yourself as you're reviewing it. But 1-line statements are perfect for trying to evaluate evidence. But oftentimes we can't do that, so we end up, you know, with 2 to 3 lines, if not 4 lines of text. But again, you're trying to classify which ones of these scenarios it fits the best, right? And so if it fits scenario A, you give it a plus, right? So evidence piece 1, you know, if whatever it is, you know, if it fits scenario A, it gets a plus, you know, positive, and then it gets minus for B and C, right? You look at evidence piece 2, it fits scenario B, but it doesn't fit, but it has no bearing on scenario C. And you look at evidence piece 3, it fits both scenario 1 and 3 and negates scenario 2 or scenario B, right? And so in that regard, right, you are now doing, like, this is how you quantify your findings using structured analytic techniques with qualitative data, right? Because if you are forced to put your brain through this, right, and it's just you, which oftentimes doing ACH, when I've had to do this in my career, it's been just me, and then I take my findings to someone else with the evidence and I'm like, here, dude, take a look and let me know what you think. You know, and then if he has different findings, if he comes out with different outcomes, that's now a discussion point to understand interpretation. And then we have to document that, because if we both get contradictory findings, it's important to let the policymaker know, like, we don't agree. Here's why we don't agree. You know, because what we are doing as Intel professionals is informing policymakers, right? So again, the goal, replicate it. And if you get a different finding, no issues, as long as the model can be replicated, right? And so, and what this does is it keeps you from using system 1 intuition. Like your system 1 piece is really kind of in this evidence narrative as you're trying to intuit what you're reading and how it fits, but it's really like it's forcing you into system 2, because when you look at your scenario outcome or your hypothesis and you read the piece of evidence, you're now analyzing the two against each other, right? And so it's a means of addressing inherent cognitive bias, which I think I use 2 terms simultaneously that mean the same thing. It's okay. So in my presentation, in my dissertation, again, looking, if you remember the previous slide, it, you know, that was the equation, right? You know, they give you an equation, you got to work. This is what the problem looked like, right? So so when you look at these outcomes, you can start to see that maybe a null hypothesis doesn't necessarily factor into the national security domain or to understanding if UAP poses a threat or a risk proposition. And so that's why we went scenario outcomes, right? So, and really some could say that outcome 1 would be my null hypothesis, but, you know, being that we're starting essentially at, you know, I would say net 0 with looking at UAP qualitative data and understanding if it informs threatening behavior, developing hypotheses becomes rather difficult. And so, you know, that's why, again, when you read through this, you can see why it's framed a certain way, right? So, you know, outcome 1, these events are just what they are. They indicate nothing. You know, there's no threat. They just happen. Outcome 2, it's a technical program within the U.S. And if it's that, there's no problem to U.S. national security, you know. And so and that's also important to put that in there, is that you know, if it's a technological program within the U.S., chances are they're not using it against their own people. Therefore, there's no national security threat, right? You know, outcome 3, foreign competitor has some sort of technical program, and now there is a possible threat. And I dislike using the term possible and threat in a sentence, because it's either threat or not. But after talking through with my dissertation committee, we all agreed that this is the best means to try and hit the point home about, you know, the role of a foreign competitor having it. Because if an ally has it, does that indicate threat to national security? Right. You know, and that's understanding is like foreign competitor doesn't necessarily mean adversary. Right. And so that's why we went with possible threat. And then when we look at outcome 4, and then also the term foreign in this context is defined as in like how we look at foreign, you know, with nation under the nation state model, right? You know, from the treaties of Westphalia, what does foreign mean in that regard, going way back to, was it 1600s, 1500s? I think when that was signed, you know, so in that regard, that's what foreign means, right? And so then we look at outcome 4, that these are a combination of technological capabilities that we don't understand, and there's no indication that it's from the US or a foreign competitor. You know, doesn't mean it can't be from the US or foreign competitor. Doesn't mean we've had something or somebody's had something in their silos since the 1940s, right? Just means we don't know what it is, right? And so, you know, there's no wild speculation coming off of it. It's strictly a statement, right? This is what we know right now. Moving in, these are my key assumptions. You know, key assumption 1, UAP or US government looked into UAP, right? There's a lot of talk and discussion around, you know, US action with regard to UAP, but you know, that's an assumption we can make. You know, cutting away you know, a lot of the issues that are discussed from people who've looked at this problem for a long time. That's what we can say. That's an assumption. They looked at it, you know, and took it into consideration, and that was that. You know, private sector groups, they try to adhere to they adhere to a standardized process, meaning that what these private sector groups are doing are attempting to apply the scientific method to studying this problem. You know, that's an assumption that we can make. You know, some groups may have shifted over time, you know, but at the end of the day, when it all started, groups that were looking at this, you know, were using a scientific process to try and figure out what it was that we were encountering, right? You know, assumption 3, which actually proved to be true when you look at the results, that, you know, UAP, you know, there is something that occurs that we are able to detect and observe, you know, and so sticking that in there, you know, further, you know, ensconces that whatever this is, and even though, and as you look through the data sets, it was proven to be at least true within the context of my study, that, you know, we can observe it, right? Assumption 4, there are some stigmas that have caused people to assume risk to their livelihood if they've reported this. I think, you know, and that is an assumption that seemed to hold throughout the data set and throughout the study as well. You know, that you know, this is, for some reason, there's stigma attached to it, and that people who used to report on this, or, you know, even at times now report on this, do so at great personal risk. You know, which creates some oddities in trying to understand, you know, the parameter of what we're looking at with this problem. And assumption 5, you know, you know, Russia and China, authoritarian governments. So when you look at the maps, there's not a lot of reports coming out of Russia or China. You know, the assumption that I went with as a national security professional is that the lack of reports is more due to their governments being authoritarian than it is that events aren't happening, right? So less authoritarian government typically means more people willing to talk. More people willing to talk in the end means more reports.
Makes sense.
And we'll pause here for questions.
Well, I'll be a gentleman and let Michael go first. If you have a question already loaded, Michael.
Can I share my screen to explain the question that I have?
Believe so. I believe you have the ability to do so.
When you talk about possibly threat, you said that you don't like the term, you don't like saying possible threat in the same sentence. And I understand why, because threat indicates a possibility. But there's 2 ways I can imagine interpreting that statement. What was the statement in the actual thing?
The phenomenological events indicate a foreign competitor. Hold on. The phenomenological events indicate a foreign competitor-based technical program there is a possible threat to national security.
There is a possible threat. Okay. So I can imagine two totally different way, and they sound very similar, but they actually logically mean something totally different. Two different ways of interpreting that statement. And I've written them out in symbolic logic here to for any like logic nerds out there. But statement one says there exists something, we'll call it X, and it's possible that X is a threat. And interpretation two is it's possible that there exists something that is a threat. Does one or the other of those sound more like what you're saying? Like
One does.
the first one is saying there definitely exists a thing. It's possible that the thing is a threat. And the second one says it's possible that there exists a thing that might be a threat, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the thing exists.
Yes, it's
so
number one.
You're saying that we are certain there is a thing there. It might pose a threat, as opposed to we're not.
We are certain that the indications are present that a thing is there.
Yes,
right?
the indications.
And this is where we get in. I think I was talking to somebody the other day called this like the subjunctive the subjunctive, like you put a whole lot of qualifying terms in there and people are like, oh, you're giving yourself wiggle room. I mean, we don't know what it is. We know, I mean, we only know through qualitative analysis what it is. Physicists are pressing hard to get, the quantitative, and again, I'm probably gonna say this wrong, the quantitative analysis to figure out what it is, right? But, what we have essentially is a whole bunch of reports, and I'm gonna divert real quick. And I think this is integral. UAPX, did something, UAPX did something that is common within the means by which, within the U.S. intelligence community that we look to try and gather data, right? Like we had an event that occurred off of Catalina Island, right? Radar indications, all this stuff happens. You have pilot reports. When they turned on UAPX, they didn't just walk outside of their university and turn it on and say, hey, what's up in the sky, right? Like they went to where the event happened. And that's integral to UAP research, and I do know of other researchers that are starting to do the same thing. But what made that action by UAPX so unique is they used a multimodal sensor array to do it, to where they looked at these pilots are stating X, so let's take this out and see if we can see something now. Now, of course, maybe there's some degradation in what could have been, more profound findings because so much time elapsed. But, if you can close that response space, we might be able to get beyond having to use a whole bunch of qualitative terms to explain what it is we're looking at. And so when we say, as what you have on your screen, quote, there definitely exists something X, and it's possible X is a threat, end quote, right? The term definitely can stay, right? I would change your statement to say indications are present that something exists, and it's possible what exists is a threat, right? So, but we don't know that yet. And the best way I think to do that is going to be to take the human sensor, and we'll see in subsequent slides as well in my recommendations, couple them with deployable multimodal sensor arrays, to where not only can you detect what is what the observer may be or may have stated, right? There's even possibility to apply. And Maya Cowan talks about this at the Society's conference about means of gathering data points on the experiencer themselves or the contactee or the observer during the moment of observation, right? So we can understand what's happening with the individual while they're having the observation. That better refines the data set. Again, right, removing all biases to this. What's important to understand is that we have people that continue to report events, right? And so the person needs to be included with the report, right? And so that way, when we look at logical statements like what you're proposing, the term definitely may be able to be used, but we're not there yet, which is why I would rephrase that and say, indications are present that something is there, and it poses a possible threat.
I like it. Thank you. That's a great answer.
Yeah, it blows my mind listening to you guys talk, because at some point I get lost, my eyes go cross-eyed. I'm like, I got lost somewhere. I just smile and I go, huh?
I feel that way. Most of the day I feel.
Yeah, it's just when, especially when my wife talks to me, I just glaze over and I'm like, okay. It's she knows that already. It's no surprise to her. What I was thinking about is, because you're going through this analytical process, and obviously, you're doing this manually at home, you're entering the data, but we're entering a world of AI. Michael and I were talking to Matthew James Bailey the other week, and AI is getting to a point where it could grab everything that you have, and you could tell it, okay, search up this, and can you give me an analytical approach? And eventually it'll be able to do that very fast. And I'm wondering if AI will be used not only by organizations like Aero and all these other programs out there like NASA. Are they going to start using AI to make sense of data that we can't see because of our biases as a species?
I know that within the US government and within DoD, AI will most likely have a role. I can't speak beyond that because it's nascent,
Mm.
and I'm not informed enough on the overarching capabilities of AI or large language models or NLP. I think that's natural language progression. Like, I might have got the term wrong there. Like,
Processing.
I'm sorry?
Natural language processing.
Yeah, natural language processing. I'm not, informed enough on those to be able to fully answer that. What I can say is that I would have appreciated, some sort of AI machine learning model to extrapolate, data from, what I deemed as data from these PDFs, to better inform, data sets. And then I'm going back and checking like what they're pulling out to make sure that it makes sense, right? The reason why I didn't go that route is that when I started with the notebooks, and this is what you stringently adhere to your rules. You start with notebooks and a pen, you end with notebooks and a pen. And so, I've been in some talks with some people who better understand that capability and can inform me on how to apply it to something like this. And I know that I know it happens. I talk to data scientists and like, oh yeah, we just work X, Y, and Z. We ingest it this way, and then it pulls. I just didn't go that route to start looking to see what programs could be created or purchased to do this because I started with a notebook.
I mean, it's hard because you have to know exactly what to tell the AI to do.
Yeah.
And when you're working with text, it's like, man, figuring out rules that would work to scan all these texts is sometimes more work than just reading the text themselves. But I can give you one example I know of AI that's being used in this sort of UAP space. So before we had digital photography, planetarium, what are they so sort of large telescopes used these photographic glass plates to photograph the sky, and there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of these plates that they just look like black plates with white dots on them that are the stars, right? But now we're scanning those into computers, and we can tell an AI system to take those old photographic images and new photographic images of the same part of the sky, superimpose them on each other and see if anything has changed. And we're finding all these things that we thought were stars from the initial plates that have just vanished. and that don't
Hmm.
actually seem like stars. I mean, in some places, there's as many as like 9 of these objects that within the space of 30 minutes or an hour have vanished. Uh, and they almost certainly aren't stars, and they're almost certainly not anything, they're not a mistake of the photography or something. So there were objects, and these are from like the 1940s and 50s. So this is before any satellites existed. And that work would be almost impossible just for individuals to do, to look at all. I mean, these plates have thousands of dots on them, but an AI program can very quickly superimpose them and be like, "Oh, that's changed, that's changed." But
I think that's Beatrice
yeah,
Villarreal.
Villarreal's, yeah,
Yeah,
we're
she's, I
sort
mean,
of
and
that
that's
project.
groundbreaking. I'll tell you, if I could, I would have the work she's doing, coupled with another space-based model that is able to like photograph what's coming in from space, overlaid with, a multimodal sensor array that is both static, like the Galileo project, and deployable, like the UAPX project, right? Have those two integrated, or all these platforms integrated with the human sensor.
Hmm.
And
Mhm.
then you decrease the deployment time from observation and report to when you dispatch the multimodal sensor array, right? And then you can overlay that with what the Galileo project finds, and what other companies that are talking about in at least in the in a citizen science workshop with like their capabilities, that they have some unique platforms to where that they can do, I'm going to use the wrong terms, but it's what I got: trace signature analysis of anomalies in the sky. You overlay that with what space-based platform you have and what Beatrice is doing over with, I think it's the Vasco project, right? And now you have a fully fledged holistic UAP research capability that will refine your databases and truly find the incomprehensible,
Yeah.
right? Like that's like key to looking at all these disparate, research, um, models and efforts that are going on. How do we integrate it into one? And the one of the key points that the philosophers discussed at the Society for UAP Studies is that uh, we start looking at what could be forms of, again, I'm going to get it wrong, but forms of thought and belief like neutral monism, and how that affects what a an observer may, how they may interpret that encounter, right? That's key to understanding, what could very well be a physiological response to what they observe, right?
Mm.
And so there's a means to integrate it and to better refine the data sets. So while we're thinking about how to think about UAP, we can also have a means to do it. And it would be overlaying Beatrice's project with another space-based platform, um, with
Yeah.
atmospheric, detection capabilities, all the way down to the person interviewing the observer, and shortening that deployment process between your technical capabilities. That's, I
Yeah,
mean,
it definitely needs to be this multimodal sort of research project that we haven't quite figured out how to get all the cooperative pieces together. But I think that's where we're moving now, as the
yep,
UAP
yep.
research community, at
Well,
least.
yeah, and
Slowly
it's
but surely.
every single discipline, every single one is needed, from philosophy to geology. I don't care, everything, biology, it's all included, and we all got to do our parts to try to figure out from what we can from the work that we do. But in the
Yeah.
sense of, you were talking about the threat narrative, I think if the possibility and the probability that the threat narrative is real, that should take precedence, because it's not just the threat narrative of them and their technology over us, but us and their technology in our hands. You could say, oh, well, it's no threat if the technology is in the hands of the US military. And I say, au contraire, mon frère, because, it's been known that governments can turn on their people. And when you got the capabilities of playing God, and we know how fallible and how weak we are as a species, I just think that that's something that's inevitable. It's going to, maybe not at first, But this technology, as it gets out there to the public, it always goes to the rich first after the military complex. The rich have it. So now there's going to be a greater divide between this technology. There's so many different threats. What does it do to the spiritualism? Is it addictive? Is their technology addictive? There's all these subcategories of fears, I think, that come with what is the threat narrative. It's not just because we always think like, War of the Worlds, but no, what are the other threats that are involved? Is there health consequences to using this technology or using technology so far advanced that we haven't discovered yet? What does that do to our species moving forward? So it's very interesting because we're at this point where we're catching on that they're there. But now we're also trying to catch on to like, well, what are the implications? What are the consequences of us not acting or acting towards it? Do they want to interact? Do we want to interact? It's a weird time, but it's a great time at the same time because you're seeing that awaken only in people like yourselves that are working on a scientific coalition, but in our government, you're seeing it in entertainment. Everybody is stepping up and saying, hey, something's not right. We all feel it. We all know it. Something's not right. And now we're pushing for it, which I think is a great step. I just want to mention before we close, guys, Michael has started doing the podcast actually for the Scientific Coalition, and he's rocking it.
Yeah,
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Josh is was one of our podcast team members, and we launched a podcast for the SCU called the Anomalous Review, and it's mostly a research overview project where we interview people I interview people who are doing specific pieces of research, and they take me through the work that they've been doing, and it's a little bit geeky and wonky and nerdy and not as story driven as we do over here. But it's, if you want to take like a slightly more academic, narrower dive per episode, come and check out an episode over there. We've got the first 3 episodes are out, and they include the leaders of SCU, the people who founded the organization, explaining to me why SCU even exists and why it sort of separated itself from MUFON to create a new organization. The second episode is with Kevin Knuth talking about a particular study he did analyzing the energy that would have been required to accelerate some of the really documented UAP that we have. The third episode is Julia Mossbridge, who talks about psi effects and ESP, and a research project that she has to do with AI. And we've got Gary Nolan coming next, and Chris Mellon, and all sorts of other people. But it's definitely a different flavor from what we do on this show. But I think that it's a nice complement to the space of like UAP discussions.
And it goes together with what we do because the point is to study the phenomenon. So if you're digging this, but you're like, I'd like to a little bit more in depth on this, that's what it's for, right?
Yeah.
And that's why this content is being put out. And I'm so proud of you guys, man. Like the SCU is rocking it, and having guys like yourselves being so devoted to this is well, it's inspiring to us all, I think. So part 3 is coming up soon. We're going to schedule that. We're going to get that done. I look forward to finding out everything else that you found out with this analytical process that to me gives me a headache. And I'm a chess player, and that gave me a headache just seeing the scrutiny that you're going through to make sure that this is exactly the way it should be.
All right, Jason, I play chess and it gives me a headache, so it works out.
You know what? I think each their own. Some things you're more gifted than this stuff, the analytical stuff. I'm creative. I could get there eventually creatively. I can't get there by thinking about it. So thank you so much, guys, for paying attention again this week. We will be back. I believe Katie will be back for episode 3 and the conclusion, of course, of Joshua Pierson's, I was going to say lecture. It's a dissertation and a presentation. And then we'll have a bunch of questions. I think I've been adding all my questions from episode 1, 2, and then 3.
Perfect.
So prepare for that, my man.
Sounds good, brother.
Awesome, guys.
Thanks for having me on again.
Of course.